What we need from the federal government is more support. We're dealing with nation-state actors. We had a county that got taken offline for 100 hours because of the cyber attack. That's the type of support we need from the federal government. Not nationalization, not trying to get our voter database. They're trying to find fraud that really isn't there.
Well, that's Washington Secretary of State Steve Hobbs speaking recently about the attacks on voting in our state. It's a system that could see some major changes soon after a momentous U.S. Supreme Court decision this week. Also, it's time to celebrate light rail crossing Lake Washington coming up this weekend. But folks in Ballard and West Seattle might not be breaking out the party hats just yet. Some sobering news about the Sound Transit expansion project has come to light. Plus, what is that chirping noise on the sidewalk? Let's just say it's not what you think. All these stories and so much more this week on Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I am a host on the Seattle channel. The views expressed here are mine, and I'm with my friend and co-host David Croman, City Hall reporter for the Seattle Times. So, David, I wanted to check in with you on this. The Seattle Mariners just set a team record for fan attendance at spring training. So does that mean A, the weather was really nice, B, fans are desperate for another playoff run for this team, C, it's important to get in a good preseason sweat so you're ready for the end of the season, or D, all of the above?
Yeah, I think D, all of the above.
Yeah.
I'm jealous of you and everyone else who got to travel down to the nice weather down there. And then, yeah, I think there's real enthusiasm around the team.
Yeah, I got to stop rubbing that in. I'm sorry, man, but that was a pretty rad trip. Anyway,
Yeah.
Thank you, David. Thanks to all of our patrons. If you are not a patron, please become one and support the show. You get Patrons First podcast, a plan in the works for another one of those coming soon, plus a really cool decal for your water bottle or laptop. Find Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon. Thanks also for watching this podcast on Converge Media. The video version of the show is on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. And a shout out to our show sponsor, Phillips Law Firm. Life doesn't come with a warning. If an auto accident disrupts your world, Phillips Law Firm is there to make it right. With over 80 years of combined legal experience, they fight for the compensation you deserve. Call 1-800-JUSTICE or visit justiceforyou.com. Phillips Law Firm, unleashing justice for you. All right, let's do this. Time for Right Here, Right Now. Well, big news for your ballot this week, folks. The U.S. Supreme Court heard arguments in the case that could end the practice of counting ballots received after Election Day. That is, of course, allowed in Washington state, 17 other states and territories. If that ballot is postmarked on Election Day, you're good to go. But the conservative majority on the court sounded pretty critical of laws that allow for these late-arriving ballots. The court will make a final ruling this summer. David, I really saw this as big news here. How do you see this affecting elections in Seattle and statewide if what the majority says turns into the final ruling here?
Yeah, I mean the notion of being able to count ballots that have been arrive late. I mean, it sort of undergirds the vote by mail system because that system treats Election Day as the last time you're able to actually vote rather than the last time it'll be counted. And so if it turns out that those votes that arrive late will not be counted, I think that could undermine a lot of the trust in vote by mail generally, which frankly might be part of the goal here.
Yeah.
There are a few efforts by this Trump administration to roll back voting by mail. Not that the Supreme Court is directly related to the Trump administration, but It's a conservative court. And, this is, I think, I'm trying to imagine what it would look like. I think probably what would happen is King County and the Secretary of State would have to basically set a new date by which you should no longer be voting by mail and say basically probably the Thursday or Wednesday before the election. This is the last date that you can send. Otherwise, drop in a Dropbox, or they'd probably honestly have to set up more voting in person stations. Right now, there are a few of them, mostly for people, in the train, Union Station. There's a few, I think, mostly for people who might have trouble filling in a ballot on their own. They'd probably have to scale that up. So it would be a big logistical challenge and probably have an impact on the total number of the total turnout in Washington state.
I was going to say that too, and it would cost some extra money, I think, too, to ramp up the systems in that way. Take me down this path. I don't know if I'm crazy on this one, but I think about all the younger voters who skew more progressive, who come out with late ballots. Let's say this law was in place last year. Does Katie Wilson not become Seattle's next mayor? Am I taking it too far?
When you win by only 2,000 votes, then no, it wouldn't take a lot to change that result.
Yeah.
Again, I think there would probably be a bigger education campaign, and
Yeah.
I would think that I would think the drop, because a lot of the people that voted for Katie Wilson, and the reason why I think you see a lot of that late swing is because she has a lot of voters in denser parts of the city, and particularly Capitol Hill. And of course, it's easier for people who live in those areas to just walk over to a drop box and drop off their ballots. And, I wouldn't think that this would necessarily change their ability to do that,
Okay.
because, election workers go that night and pick up all
Hmm.
those ballots. So they're
Yeah.
there on election night. And all they have to do is count them.
Right.
But certainly, yeah, I think a lot of people on the last day, particularly in Washington, where you don't have to pay for the postage on a ballot, so it just
Right.
makes it really easy to toss your ballot in the mail at the last minute.
Hmm.
Um, so, at the same time, King County already has, this year we saw it a bit, where they were saying, because there was some questions about USPS's ability to actually get mail
Right.
to deliver mail. So already King County was saying, hey, if you haven't submitted your ballot yet, you should probably go to the drop box. So
Yeah.
they have sent out some of that messaging already, but this would just kind
Right.
of scale that up on a much grander scale.
Yeah, last touch on this. I don't know how the court's going to decide on this one. Again, some of these arguments indicated that they might rule indeed in favor of this idea that election day is the last day for ballots to come in, et cetera. But does it turn into a concern over votes for the military overseas? I mean, it feels like there's a lot of different pieces to this that could be impacted. It's a big concern, I think.
Yeah, that's a good point about military. And also, like, makes me think about how, in Seattle and King County, it is gospel that the late arriving ballots and the late counted ballots go left, but that's not true everywhere. In Eastern Washington, the late ballots tend to actually be a little more conservative. So it's not,
Yeah.
I think it's not necessarily guaranteed what that would mean for political outcomes across
Okay.
the state.
Yeah. Yeah.
Necessarily, particularly for statewide candidates, it would have an influence, I'm sure, in Seattle and King County, but as far as what it means for the progressive candidates, but
Yep.
it's not like a guaranteed outcome if something like this were to come to pass.
Got it. Thank you. I need help taking off my Seattle blinders sometimes. So I appreciate that. All right. Well, folks, fire up your Orca card because light rail across Lake Washington is finally a reality coming up this weekend. The plan is to open that over lake route on Saturday. This system is the first in the world to go over a floating bridge. And David, before we get into some concerns with the system, the bigger system in Ballard and West Seattle specifically, I want to think about some perspective here. How big a deal is it to have light rail open across Lake Washington? And also, how reliable is this service going to be? I think those are two big questions.
Yeah, as my colleague Nick Deshays said, it kind of turns it from a line into a system.
Mm,
And I think that's a good way of putting it, which is now, you can transfer trains. Uh, I think also it's just, I think because of the geography of it and it
hmm
crossing a lake, it really is the most stark example of what I think Sound Transit's goal is with this light
hmm
rail system, which is to connect communities. Of
Yeah, I
course,
mean,
that
I was
has
going to
happened
say,
already. Go ahead.
no, I was just going to say, I mean, when you talk about moving from Seattle to Redmond in the span of maybe 40 minutes or something like that, it feels like absolute sorcery to me. But please keep going.
Well, yeah, and it's not the first couple of communities to be connected. Of course, you can get from Linwood to Seattle
Hmm
and
hmm
Federal Way, and but there's something about Bellevue and Seattle being now a train right away. I think that is significant, being the two big cities. And again, it's just this piece of crossing the lake, and the fact that there is a whole line now on the east side. It's not just really about connecting one city to another. It is really bringing a sort of region more
Yeah,
generally closer together.
yeah,
I think it's also big for, not to be overlooked what it means for like the central district, because
sure.
has been a exclusively north-south line up until
hmm
this point. And so this is the first time that it'll be going east-west. Um, and that I think, my colleague Nick also wrote a really great story about kind of what the highway construction meant, particularly for the Black communities of
hmm
that area, and how obviously this isn't fully remedying the damage done by that, but is a piece to kind of reconnecting
Mm,
some of those
yeah,
communities,
yeah.
which I thought was a great way of putting it. Uh, but also just, up to this point, if you lived east or west of the line right now, the light rail never really made a lot of sense. And
Yeah.
so now you have, you're bringing on a whole new section of the city that can tap into the one line a little better.
Yeah. And I wanted to talk about kind of the reliability of the service overall and maybe fold in this other big issue for Sound Transit. I mean, how much celebrating are we really talking about when the latest news for West Seattle says, hey, we're actually going to take out a stop that was planned in Ballard, might not get there at all for a little while. I want to talk about the future of the system and what you're seeing overall, because I have to say some mixed news out of Sound Transit over this past week.
Yeah, it's not particularly encouraging, and they were hoping that the legislature would give them the right to do 75-year bonds, and that would have, I think I read, basically represented a $4 billion relief for them, which is
Yeah.
basically they can stretch some of these payments out over longer, and
Yeah.
that would help. The legislature didn't take that, and that puts them in a hard position where, the finances of just big mega projects has really been difficult. Obviously, we talk about inflation a lot, but
Hmm.
when I was covering the transportation beat, there was nothing like mega construction projects that were getting hit to that scale
Yeah.
by
Yeah.
inflation. It was just the culmination of so many things that was causing these projects to go through the roof. And I think Sound Transit is just really struggling with that and is forcing some hard decisions here.
They are indeed. We'll have to see what happens this weekend, but some exciting news for Sound Transit regardless. So again, that lake crossing coming up here on March 28th, so keep an eye out for that. Up next, what is next now that Mayor Katie Wilson has announced a pause on expanding surveillance cameras in Seattle? Some insights coming your way next on Now Hear This. Wait, pause. That's the message from Seattle Mayor Katie Wilson, who said late last week she is pausing the planned addition of police closed-circuit TV cameras, with an exception for the area around the stadiums before the World Cup happens. She will not turn off any of the cameras the city currently uses, except for one near a clinic that offers reproductive health services. Why the pause? Well, here's a little bit of what the mayor said late last week.
I believe it is not good governance to expand a pilot program without completing an evaluation of its impacts. That's why I'm pausing the planned expansion until we are able to complete an audit and strengthen protections. We are working with NYU's policing project to conduct the data governance and privacy audit. This audit will specifically examine whether current policies and practices address potential harms to civil rights and civil liberties adequately.
David, I know you wrote about this in the Seattle Times. What do you make of this decision? What happens now?
It's a diplomatic decision, I think. She acknowledged that she has learned a lot about the impact, what these cameras mean since taking office. And by that, I mean, it sounds like she has spent a lot of time with the Real-Time Crime Center. And I think she has heard some convincing cases from people about maybe some of the value of these cameras. At the same time, she said she still holds a lot of the concerns that she did on the campaign trail about how they would be misused, by federal immigration enforcement specifically, but she
Yeah.
kind of alluded to her uneasiness with just the general expansion of a surveillance state in Seattle.
Yeah.
And so what this does is she's kind of trying to cover her bases here. It in one way makes good on a campaign promise to pause the expansion here.
Right.
At the same time, I think one of her biggest holdups was we're about to have this World Cup.
Hmm.
Oh, by the way, Iran was supposed to be one of the teams playing in Seattle.
Right.
The worst case scenario is these cameras theoretically could have been used to help solve or prevent some kind of incident that happens, and then they're not on. So
wow. Yeah. Okay.
so she has, I think, clearly responding to that, has decided to install these cameras in the stadium area, but not turn them on in case there's a credible threat.
Yeah.
Councilmember Kettle has already pushed back on that assertion. He's saying we should have these on because you don't always know when that threat is credible or not.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think what it's trying to do is give her some space to make a decision. And my read is this audit that she's undertaking would have to turn something up specifically for her to permanently pause them, because she said in the press conference, if it comes back and says, we feel comfortable with the use of this technology in Seattle and we don't see any issues here, she acknowledged she would probably go forward with the expansion. So I think it is simultaneously making good on a campaign promise to not allow the expansion to go forward, while also giving her some kind of seemingly objective cover in the event that she does end up moving forward with them.
Yeah, and just going a little bit further down that path with Bob Kettle, the council member who happens to be the lead, the chair of the Public Safety Committee on the council. I actually talked to him on Seattle Channel about this. Check out the Council Edition show, folks, if you haven't already. Some interesting stuff with Councilmember Kettle and Councilmember Rivera. But Kettle was saying this additional research or auditing the mayor is asking for, he's saying this has already been done. We've been studying these things for some time. So this additional type of research is really just slowing things down. I know that he put out a press release about this pause last week. I know that Councilmember Rivera put out a press release about that last week. Do you see some tensions rising there, or how is the council going to take this when the new information comes in from this audit?
I think it depends on what she does with that information and how
Yeah.
long it takes to get there. I think there was some sort of just basic acknowledgement that, this was something she talked about on the campaign trail, and so she needs to do something here. And I think generally speaking, advocates of these cameras who were bracing for her to say that she was going to permanently stop this expansion or even turn off some of the cameras, I think some of them are pleasantly surprised and
Yeah.
are feeling like this is the best case scenario, which is she's not making any firm declarations, just saying she wants to get a better grasp on this.
Yeah.
So in that sense, I think they feel good. On the other hand, I know that there is council frustration because, it wasn't just an executive order to add these cameras. There was a
That's
bill
right.
that was proposed and passed by the council. And so I think there is some frustration that this is the mayor basically ignoring an ordinance to say that these cameras should be expanded. We see this sometimes, particularly around when money is given to a program that the mayor's office does have some latitude to just not spend that money or
Yeah.
not, because, it is up to the executive branch to actually implement laws. And
Hmm.
there's not a lot that the council can do if the mayor's office just decides that they don't want to implement something. But
Yep.
I think there is a decent point there that there was a piece of legislation that got passed that said we should be adding cameras here.
Yeah.
And the money that was tied to that spending has to kind of in this limbo period that I'm sure is frustrating for them. But again, I think they are counting their wins to an extent that she isn't making any big declarations around surveillance. She's just saying that she wants to seek out more information, and
Yeah.
they're going to, I think, for the most part, give her space to do that. If she decides that what she hears convinces her that they should all be turned off, then I think there might be a bigger fight.
Yeah, and Kettle and Rivera are both saying we need to get this review done before the World Cup, before June. I know that the gears of government can turn slowly sometimes. Is the mayor going to be able to have enough time to get information in, audit these cameras, and make a decision before June?
I don't know. She did say that she wants it to be months. When I asked her, how long she expected the audit to take place, that how many months though is an important
Yeah,
is
it's
an
an
important
important
detail
distinction there.
because
Yeah,
the World Cup is what, 3 months away at this
right.
point. So it seems like a quick turnaround to me, but I don't know.
Yeah, we'll have to see what happens next on that one. That's a big decision for the mayor coming up, and the council's involved with it too. I did want to point out that the council is actually engaged in several important issues this week, from updating floodplain maps to making sure there's a cable agreement to keep Seattle Channel on the air. I personally very thankful for that. I wanted to tackle an issue that is going to impact a neighborhood near you in Seattle. So urban planning in the form of the comprehensive plan as we enter what's called the Centers and Corridors process, a meeting on this late last week. David, as I'm seeing this, the focus is now, as we kind of move through this plan process, the focus is now on these 30 so-called neighborhood centers the city wants to establish, which would allow these residential and mixed-use buildings up to 6 stories in the core and then 4- and 5-story residential buildings towards the edges. What are you expecting to come out of this process? What do you think?
Yeah, of all of the pieces of the comprehensive plan, it feels like this particular one is maybe the most pro forma in that the council, the council has already signaled and approved its support for the boundaries of these neighborhood centers and kind of the areas of focus that the city will move forward with adding new density. Now they just kind of need to go back and do the actual zoning changes to allow the density to take place within those. So could there be some discussion around exactly how big these apartment buildings go? I think they could go smaller. I don't think they could go bigger because that would trigger a whole new round of kind of environmental review.
Hmm.
Um, but this was technically introduced by the Katie Wilson mayoral administration, but it's really a carryover from last year. This is a bill that was essentially fully baked before
Hmm.
the election from the
Yeah.
Harrell administration. The Wilson administration could have, in theory, kind of gone in there and made some changes if they wanted to, but they were advised that if they do that, that would probably trigger additional environmental review and it
Yeah.
would stretch out this particular piece of legislation. So what they've opted to do is essentially send this piece as it was written. It'll probably get passed relatively untouched by this council, and then they will circle back to the third stage of the comprehensive plan,
Hmm.
where, to the extent Mayor Katie Wilson wants to put her own stamp on this
Yep.
process, she and her administration will have the opportunity to do that then, both in the third, and then there's a fourth step here too. So
Hmm.
I think that is where we will see maybe some more big policy swings by the Wilson
Yeah.
administration, but it's not really in this one.
Yeah, I know what you mean. It is a little bit of a devil in the details piece, though, when you think about the different state laws that have been passed just over the past year that are impacting this process. It was really interesting late in this meeting, a kind of a hidden piece of this analysis from city staff, but they actually showed that there might be a reduction in the amount of housing the comprehensive plan is supposed to build as to what they thought last year, around 5 or 10%. Staffers were saying there's a more detailed analysis coming soon, but I just wanted to talk about that a little bit further because sometimes you've got some competing priorities here. Like, okay, the state says we want or less housing here, but more housing here. In that area that has less housing, maybe the city has a mandatory housing affordability rule in place, which could create a challenge in getting anything built. Do you see what I mean there with that whole competing
Mhm.
priorities thing?
Yeah, and it is also gets at the challenge of predicting and forecasting exactly what these regulatory changes will mean for housing
Yeah.
construction.
How
And
they going to pencil out?
um,
Right.
yeah, and I think that's a moving target too, because I think that within City Hall there's a lot of discussion not just about the comprehensive plan, but other housing policies that the city has around the mandatory housing affordability plan or other pieces as the city looks for ways to kind of kickstart market rate development
Hmm.
in Seattle. And so I think the entire housing conversation is a little bit of a moving target,
Yeah.
though, certainly worth noting some of the revisions that are being made around forecasts and predictions.
Oh yeah, a lot of devils in those details. So something we'll be tracking here, and if you'd like to keep track of it too, folks, the next public hearing on that is coming up on April 6th for the comprehensive plan. All right, well, coming up, what is that chirping on the sidewalk? A springtime story that you literally have to hear to understand. That story just ahead on What's Next. David, this is one of those springtime stories I thought I'd never see, but here we go. Lime scooters in Seattle will soon be getting AI and cameras installed to potentially shame people into not riding on the sidewalk. So, this tech has been tested in Seattle and other cities recently, but Seattle's fleet of scooters, we understand, is going to be the first in the country to get a full conversion. So, thousands of these bikes out there, these scooters, I should say. So, essentially, if you ride on the sidewalk, which is illegal, folks, you'll hear little chirping alerts, which will urge people to stop riding on the sidewalk. David, is this going to work? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it probably will. I use those
It'll work
scooters
at
and
annoying people, but yeah, keep going.
yeah, exactly. This is I am an avid user of these scooters. I find them to be helpful to connect Seattle's occasionally disconnected public transit system. I like using them to get to big events. I am also sympathetic to a lot of the concerns that people have around, particularly, the fact that they are often left in places that they shouldn't be, but also, you do see people on these scooters on sidewalks. You see it a lot, particularly now on the waterfront.
Mm,
Even though there's that bike lane there, people still
right.
using the sidewalks. And so, I think the companies are trying to preempt these concerns, trying to get ahead of them and avoid any sort of possible discussion about them not being allowed in cities at all.
Hmm.
Uh, so we've seen a push for, there are now new requirements to take a, you know, take a picture of how you've parked and where you
Right.
can park. And if you aren't in a place like that, they won't let you turn off your ride. They
Right.
are making a lot of changes to try and get ahead of the backlash and pressure to just crack down on these generally. And it seems like this fits into it. Certainly, I do think that there's a piece of it, which is a lot of people rent these, maybe never having used a scooter or used the bike network in Seattle before. And so having them kind of chirp at you to say you shouldn't be here, I would think would be helpful.
Yeah, it's one of these interesting things. And I remember you reporting on this as a transportation reporter for the Times not too long ago. There's a number of different safety concerns with these scooters. There's no way around that. But I am struck by this paradox that it might get a little confusing. So you've got this alert to don't ride this on the sidewalk, but make sure you get that scooter out of the street and maybe park it on the side of the sidewalk.
Yeah.
That's a little bit of a disconnect for me.
Yeah, totally. We're seeing more. They've been painting more and more little storage areas around the city, which I think is helpful. It is, I mean, not to get kind of too 10,000 foot about it, but it is sort of just, and there's a certain level of awkwardness when a privately run company becomes sort of integral and intertwined with the city's kind of public transportation system.
Yeah.
There's just sort of an inevitable bit of tension there. And, the fact that Seattle feels obligated to paint boxes where you're supposed to store your privately rented vehicles, once all that stuff gets mixed together, it gets kind of difficult to regulate.
Yeah.
But also it is filling a gap, both literally and metaphorically in Seattle's transportation system. And so, again, I'm certainly sympathetic to some of the concerns about how well these have been integrated into the city's transportation system.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, there are taxi parking areas and stuff like that. I mean, there's different private companies. Last question on this one. This is a little bit more existential, but I wanted to throw it at you. So, artificial intelligence, of course, it does so many things for us, I guess. What is it like to feel artificial shame from a scooter? Like, is that even a thing? What am I taking it too far? What do you think?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of, are there other examples of automated
cars do that too. Like, hey, you're getting too close to the lane or something like that. Come back over. I don't know.
Right. Yeah, maybe something like that. Yeah, that's funny. Or if you get, there's like sometimes, where was I? Was walking in front of a jewelry shop the other day, and it started shouting at me that I was on camera. So there's some of this stuff woven into our society already.
I hadn't thought of that. Artificial shame. It surrounds us too. Watch out, folks. All right, we do need to wrap up, David. Thank you as always for doing the show with me. Here's the question. What's the thing you most want to see out of the Seattle Mariners on opening day this week on Thursday? What do you got?
A strong pitching matchup strong pitching performance from Logan Gilbert. If the Mariners can pitch well this year, then I think they'll win the World Series, or they could win the World Series.
Keep those guys healthy. That is the big question there. Yep. And then maybe a little bit with the bats. Do you have some good thoughts about that? This Brendan Donovan guy at third base, he could be the answer. What do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I just assume they will start slow because they're all used to being in sunny, warm Arizona, and then they come up here in cold, wet Seattle. It kind of throws their bats off. So that's why the pitching needs to start good.
There we go. I like that. I like that theory. Thank you, David. And thanks to everybody who's listening to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. Become a patron, why don't you? Check out Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon. You can pledge $5 per month or more. Thank you very much for that help. Great to have you listening to this podcast on Apple, Spotify, and actually across the world, Germany, coming on strong this past month with 10 listeners. Dankeschön. Thanks for listening in. Thanks also for watching on Converge Media. We will see you next time. Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2026.